Welcome to the second hour of the Eusebius McKaiser show, and as promised this hour we're going to be in conversation with Wilhelm Verwoed about his book Verwoerd, My Journey Through Family Betrayals. And it's interesting because when I first tweeted and also put on Instagram and Facebook about 2 weeks ago that I was reading this book, many of you responded not having read the book, having picked it up or known about its existence, and you responded on the basis of the surname Verwoed. And obviously that immediately triggered some of you because you have views about Verwoed, probably the same ones that I have, and you then also had some assumptions that you made about what this particular book could be about. A couple of my Facebook friends responded by saying, I'm going to skip this one, Eusebius, you can read it yourself. I'm not ready to read some sort of attempt to whitewash the whole narrative around Verwoed. But I can tell you what, I also was a little bit feeling in two minds about whether I should pick up this book, and once I'd started it, whether I should complete reading it. In the end, I felt rewarded for sticking with the book till the end. I think the best parts of the book, particularly, is the last couple of chapters, and I think it is a book worth buying, worth reading slowly, meditating on, and engaging with. It is written by the grandson of Verwoed, Wilhelm Verwoed, and I also knew very quickly that I would want to at least put in a request with him and his publishers to interview him about the book. But it always going to be one of those books where you must do the interview live, and that can be hard when you live in different cities. Cut a long story short, the publishers and the author had very generously agreed to me that probably this is one of those interviews that require us to be in the same space physically. And so here he is in our Sandton studios. Wilhelm Verwoed is with me. You can watch this interview on our 702 Facebook page where we are streaming it live. You can also, just as you listen to the conversation, tell me what comes up for you and use the hashtag Verwoed with Eusebius. Verwoed with Eusebius. If you have already read the book, or as you hear us talk about some of the issues in the book and you want to call in and be part of the conversation, you're also more than welcome to do that. And the number to dial, and the phone lines will be open throughout, is of course 011 883 0702. Wilhelm, goeiemorgen, and thank you so much for coming to the studio.
Good morning, Eusebius, and thank you for the invitation.
I don't even know where to start with this one. You know, I give a lot of thought to, as one does technically as a broadcaster, how to approach an interview. Do you make 1,001 post-it notes? Do you go in hard? Do you go in soft? What tone do you choose? How much generosity? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we go through as broadcasters, right? And in the end, I decided with this one, you know what, just leave all of that technical stuff and surprise yourself and Wilhelm and the listeners and just go with the flow. So I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 50 minutes. We'll just take it as it comes.
Thank you. Thank you.
So maybe an equally weird starting point then, now that I have overshared how I feel about the approach to this conversation, is to ask you how you are feeling right now and how you are feeling about being in conversation with me.
Yes, I must say I was in two minds. I mean, I know that this topic and the issues raised by the book is very difficult for people of color in South Africa. And I know also that you don't beat around the bush and that you are very clear about where we stand. But I also welcome that in the sense that this book was written with the hope that it will contribute to wider conversation.
Yeah.
And I think with your approach, I think it's a good way to continue that conversation.
So maybe we can get to one of the issues that you reflect on more explicitly towards the end. And instead of trying to talk through the book's structure, when you find yourself in the Netherlands and the flatmates that you have, and then you go to Oxford and you come back, that journey is really interesting and a really beautiful account of the changing of your own politics. But I want to get immediately to what people who haven't read the book might be wanting us to talk about off the bat. You have genetically in you the genes of Hendrik Verwoed. Many South Africans, black and white, regard Hendrik Verwoed as evil. How do you feel about the fact that you are genetically, through blood, related to the architect of apartheid?
Thank you, Eusebius. I mean, I think that is one of the big questions I'm sitting with in my life, existentially. What does it mean? And not to run away from it. I think it's tempting, and I find that in my wider family, sometimes people try and stay within the lager, try and become loyal and defend. But I found that that really is not being truthful and honest in terms of what this person, who is also my grandfather, represents to the majority of black South Africans, South Africans in general. And so I think I've been fortunate to have been on a journey where I've been exposed to that experience of what Verwoerd means to people. And not just as an individual, but what he personifies in terms of the system. And the more I understand that, the more I'm exposed to that, the more I have to say, this is something I need to face up to. I need to accept that I am linked to him. I cannot denounce my biological connection, my genealogical connection. And the question is, what am I going to do with this connection to make some contribution to address the legacy of what he represents?
With your permission, I'm going to use analogies precisely because I deliberately tried not to over-choreograph my preparation for this conversation that may feel slightly awkward at times, and I want you to just hear it with due generosity back. When we get violated and the person that violates you has got traces of them left behind in you, then it can be very difficult phenomenologically or existentially to learn to live with that permanent presence. And one might think here, for example, of, say, a rapist that rapes someone and the person falls pregnant, or slightly less violent but also violent, where, let's say, someone broke into your home and there's a permanent smell around of that particular perpetrator, and it kind of like follows you everywhere, and it leads to kind of like existential angst at a deeply subjective level. In relation to Oupa Verwoerd for you and your deep commitment to social justice, and that's been a journey that we're going to talk about later, does it at times feel really like part of your own blood is literally, existentially, sullied blood that you are walking around with and in you?
I think yes. I mean, I have to acknowledge that, and I think that is what is for me difficult about this journey. And I don't want to emphasize my difficulties, but I think there is this thing about what I prefer to talk about, the blood on my hands, that is linked to the blood in my hands, in my veins. And there's a stigma. There is a very deep wounding that is associated with this name, with this person, with this period, and with my own involvement in that system. So, I mean, the thing for me is, it's not as if, apartheid happened in a previous era. I was part of that. Up into my early 20s, I supported him. So in addition to carrying the genealogical connection, I also have the cultural, political, historical connection, which means then I'm part of it. So I cannot distance myself from him, and I cannot distance myself from what he's responsible for, because I was also part of that. And I think that helps me a little bit to say, this is also grappling with my own identity, not just with him as my grandfather.
One of the strange things, and I was saying this to a cousin of mine a couple of weeks ago, when I said to him, because a mutual friend of my cousins and I, that you also know, Kopano, said to me, you got to read this book. And I said to my cousin while reading, yeah, you know what? I love Kopano, and I just don't know about this recommendation, and I'm struggling a little bit with this book. And one of the things I struggled with is privilege. And I wanted to ask you about that. That even though you have done something, and this is where the public will incorrectly anticipate what the book is about. Spoiler alert, Wilhelm has been estranged from most of his family because he's an ANC supporter, or has been for a long time. But that there's a certain kind of privilege attached even to the surname Verwoerd, despite the fact that it is a name that is synonymous for millions of South Africans with evil. What are your reflections on that?
No, you're right. I mean, you're right. It's one of those ambiguities that I'm sitting with, that I'm getting opportunities to engage with people. I'm getting, probably this book is published because of that name to a large degree. And I have to somehow find a way to say, how can I do this with integrity? How do I do this not for the sake of some kind of ego trip or for the sake of just using this as a privilege? So So I've had the encounter, for example, with former President Mandela, but also with a number of other people who've said, this is your surname, this is something that comes with an opportunity, with a certain, well, responsibility, but an opportunity to speak out, that people will perhaps be a little bit more likely to listen when you speak from that point of view, because of the family connection, not because of me as an individual. And I've come to see that just as a symbolic reality, as an opportunity that I need to use as much as possible with integrity, but to be open to that criticism.
Towards the end of the book, and I'll tell you what I mean by what I've just said, you grapple with the danger of being a best white, and also the self-indulgence of being the exception amongst many of your relatives, to acknowledge the links with someone who was responsible for much evil in the 20th century. And at some point you almost go into a kind of conversation with yourself about the importance of guarding against being too smug about your awareness of doing good.
Thank you for pointing that out. I think especially for the larger Black South African audience, people of color, I think this is a very important point to emphasize. And all I can say is just it comes from my experience of engaging with people. And in a very visceral way, I've experienced how it means something to somebody who has been violated, to somebody who's still sitting with the legacy of that evil. When somebody who's a member of the family responsible for that is willing to say, I acknowledge, I am sorry, I wish we can find a way to address this together. And something in that kind of humble acknowledgement has been healing in my experience. But I don't want to overemphasize that and make some kind of
pat on the back.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite problematic from a white point of view to actually get affirmation and acknowledgement by Black South Africans for speaking out against apartheid. It really shouldn't be like that. It's a sign of our time that there are not enough people from my background speaking out, acknowledging, taking responsibility for restitution. Therefore, somebody like me gets inordinate, actually undeserved kind of attention, but it's actually a symptom of the sickness in our society, I think.
Eyewitness News. Breaking news.
Well, it's the breaking story this hour. The Randburg Magistrates Court has found Duduzane Zuma not guilty in his culpable homicide and negligent driving case. Magistrate Tebogo Tupatlase delivered the judgment a short while ago. Zuma was charged after his car crashed into a taxi in Johannesburg in 2014, killing passenger Pumzile Dube. We'll certainly have more on this breaking story in our next bulletin.
Eusebius McKaiser.
Eusebius McKaiser.
On 702.
You can use the hashtag Verwoerd with Eusebius. And I'm speaking to Wilhelm Verwoed, the grandson of Hendrik Verwoed, about his book, Verwoerd, My Journey Through Family Betrayals. And yes, it is a book that I recommend. You know that I won't recommend a book to you if I do not think that it is worth your time and your money and you're grappling with it. Was your Opa evil?
Well, Eusebius, I think it's very tempting for me to come to that conclusion when I look at the evil of the system. But my experience also working internationally with people who've been involved in violence in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in Israel, Palestine, and also in the United States working with veterans, has made me come to the more frightening conclusion that he was not as an individual evil. That the more frightening conclusion is that ordinary people, relatively good people like me, are able to be responsible for an evil system. And that's a more frightening conclusion, because then we cannot put him in a sort of a different category as if he's not a human being, which means I am also like him. People like me are also like him, and we cannot demonize him in a sense that makes it easier for us to live with ourselves. So that is really the scary conclusion I've come to. That
I want to unravel that a little bit, because there's an explicit sentence towards the end where you disavow the view that Hendrik Verwoed was evil, and then you talk about systems. And systems analysis is all the rage, especially in Stellenbosch, where you are from. And I love talking about structures and systems. I think they are wonderful. And like you, my early academic roots are in philosophy, and We not so much the campuses you went to before Oxford, which I think were more in tune with systems than the English traditions of Rhodes University. But I've come to love paying attention to analyses of structures in history. But here's the problem. We've got to now balance it out. Structures don't exist. Human beings do exist. And I totally get that there's a kind of exceptionalizing that happens when we take a Dr. Evil and that person becomes the ultimate and exclusive symbol of apartheid evil. But isn't the full answer and the simple answer to say, simpliciter, my oupa was evil, and baie gewone mense was ook evil.
Yeah. I mean, if we go down that route of actually saying we need to face the evil within us, I'm talking about me now and people like me responsible for the system of apartheid. And of course you can probably go beyond that, but that's not my place to say. But from my point of view, there is this potential for evil in me. And I have been part of a system that was evil. So that also is in him. What I think I would be cautious about is to make that the full conclusion about him as a whole person. That I think that would be a kind of demonization. And I don't think, in terms of my sense of what this kind of inclusive humanization approach of people like Archbishop Tutu and many other people that I've worked with, has to find a place also for him in his humanity, while facing the evil that he's responsible for and the evil that is in him, but also in me. I just cannot find myself saying my Oupa was evil without saying I am evil in the same way. And that for me is important to face.
Can I challenge you on that? I think we can, and it's not just a conceptual point, it's also a factual point. I think it is appropriate for us as human beings to recognize our capacity for evil and how evil, especially in the 20th century, became banalized. However, there's a difference between potentially being the king of Sweden and actually being the king of Sweden. Recognizing, fearing, and respecting your capacity to be a racist as Wilhelm is a very different thing to deliberately, as a political agent with massive power, legislative power, and raw force, actually enacting a program of grand and petty apartheid. And when I read that sentence in your book, after being thoroughly impressed by the journey you'd gone through with yourself, from Netherlands to UK, back to Stellies and around the Southern Cape, and immersing in the ANC in the lead up to 1994, but then towards the end of the book, you don't really want to come up with this simple judgment of Hendrik Verwoed. I thought to myself, and I humanized you here, and I grappled with whether I'm being too nice to you. I thought the reason you're resisting the conclusion isn't only because of the reconciliation work that you've been doing so amazingly, interestingly, in places like, Ireland, the Middle East, and what have you, but that you are psychologically constrained as grandson with all these memories of dad, granddad, as the everyday character, Hans by memories, going through the diaries, a lovely photo that you have in the book where he's holding you. But isn't the point precisely that there's nothing, it's no longer insightful to say ordinary people can be evil. When I say Hendrik Verwoed was evil, it doesn't mean that I rob him of humanity or that I'm blind to my own capacity for evil, but it is just a factual, historical, accurate claim to say Hendrik Verwoed was evil. And then I can have all the other tirlantainkies, the bells and whistles that must go with it in the footnote. He wasn't an alien, and I'm also capable of evil. I can put that in the footnote. But in the main text, the simple statement, Hendrik Verwoed was evil, is historically surely beyond dispute. And I wondered whether the intellectual in you who disagree with me, or whether you can recognize, and I'm just playing Dr. Phil here, that maybe you were constrained in your analysis by your psychological relationship to Oupa and some of the beautiful ordinary memories you have of him as a family man.
That's possible, Eusebius. I mean, I think I have to acknowledge that there is in me probably psychological things that I'm not even aware of, that there is this kind of blood that's thicker than water thing, that's possible that is in my subconscious, and that is part of my reluctance to just say that sentence as you just said it there. I think what I've tried to do, at least towards the end of the book, is to say, I need to say to him, he's responsible for what he did. I am not responsible in the same way that he is. So I was trying to emphasize his political responsibility. But I do struggle with let's say, the naked sentence, in the way you put it. And I think, I hope it has something to do also with my spirituality, with my faith. And I think this is where it becomes tricky. I don't know what it actually means if you just say, it's almost like the problem I have with Eugene de Kock and Prime Evil, the same problem that I had with some of the people I worked with, where they've been involved in horrible action. So their agency was clear. They were terrorists in many ways, some of the people that I worked with in other places in the world. And then people in the wider community said they were just evil. They used animal language. What we saw in Rwanda too, the way in which we ended up using, on the basis of our conclusion that somebody is evil, then we start to use that language. And that leads to that kind of processes that I think could be very dangerous. So between you and me, and I think if we're talking at a human level, I need to be willing to face fully the evil of what I'm responsible for and what he's responsible for. And we need to find a way to do that without demonizing.
Don't give too much of the book away. People must go buy it. But let's give them a taste of a little bit of the structure of the book. An important part of your journey is you get the Rhodes Scholarship. You're going to go to Oxford, but via the Netherlands. And you meet some very fascinating characters. Tell the public a little bit about that time. And can we also talk technique while we're at it? I love the wonderful use of, which millennials won't get, diaries, and to try and recall and retrace your own journey in terms of understanding your family's place in South African history.
And also handwritten letters.
Yes.
I mean, imagine.
Yes.
So, I mean, that part of the book I'm actually quite embarrassed by. And I do say it at some point, I cringe when I see the young self that went to Holland, that went to England. And I see the kind of narrow piety, this kind of ethnocentric Afrikaner national, Christian nationalism. And I deliberately chose to include some of those earlier diary entries and letters because it's so raw in the sense that it is quite honest.
I don't think you must be embarrassed. I think one of the cool things about what I liked about your sojourn in Europe is that so much of our coming of age happens as undergrads or as young postgrads with Dick's mates. And we meet interesting characters along the way. And only later do we recognize what kind of influence a late night conversation over Tassenberg might have had on you.
Yeah. I think it's being aware that those extracts will be read today also by people. Of course, they were not written with a public audience in mind. And what I don't want to do is come across as somebody trying to explain and justify and say, this is the kind of person I was, therefore you need to understand why it has taken such a long time, etc. So,
why was the Netherlands important though?
Well, it was a watershed. And I think looking back to the mid-80s, the fact that I was able to get out of Stellenbosch, this kind of cocoon of white Afrikaner, Christian, Dutch Reformed Church, Stellenbosch, to actually get out of that, I think was vital for me to be faced with the broader reality of what South Africa was really about, and to meet people and to get access to books and to get, just the whole exposure in the Netherlands at that time with the anti-apartheid movement. And then meeting people, and quite a few of them were from Afrikaner backgrounds like me, but they were much further down the line in terms of political
awakening. We're going to talk more about that, including your awakening to gay sex that might be happening close to you as well.
Yes.
So let's just, we're going to be a little bit quick on the Netherlands part, but I want us to be a little bit more precise. So you meet a range of characters, and one of the nice things about being abroad, if you have the opportunity, is that you look back to the country where you come from, your family, your politics, your society at large, through a different lens, particularly when you meet the right kind of characters that make you revisit what you thought were trite truths about your society.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was very lucky, I think, to end up in a house for 3 months with a few people like that. And there was a lovely intersectionality to that meeting, where on the one hand I was confronted politically by people speaking Afrikaans, challenging me about, conscription, challenging me about the role of the Dutch Reformed Church in justifying the system, but also somebody who was very openly gay and having a gay open relationship. And I was obviously homophobic as part of my sort of Puritan Dutch Reformed Church spirituality. So to be faced in with somebody and to hear what it actually means as an Afrikaner man to be demonized as somebody who's gay and to be thrown out of his family and out of the church and so on and so on. So that I then started to get a glimpse at the human level, what it means to be treated like that. At the same time, I'm hearing what it means to be treated as a black person. And in my mind, I think it started to come to a point, not just in my mind, I think in my heart, a sense of something fundamentally is wrong with the system, making all these claims, being justified in the name of Christianity. And this is what is happening to people on the ground. And that was the fundamental watershed, which then led me to a whole long journey of change.
It was a profound watershed for you, because it led you to also rethink your academic trajectory and what it is that you may want to get out of your time abroad as a scholar, and then coming back. And we'll fast forward for purposes of the radio clock. You come back, South Africa is on the brink of this nascent democratic project. You can't unknow the insights that you have gained both while in the UK and also in the Netherlands. But your family have a relationship with the National Party, with Oupa Verwoed. They fit into the political topography of 1994 and thereabout very differently to what had happened in the meantime to their son, to their grandson. You become, I don't want to say enamored, because it's only after 1994 that the ANC disappointed many people, but you do become enamored with the ANC. Speak into that a little bit, because the early toward the middle part of the book tells the story of the first rupture between you and family members that are still alive. Because the book isn't only about your relationship genetically and politically to the memory and the place in history of Hendrik Verwoed. A large part of it is actually about you and your father. And that's critically important. And so you decide to join the ANC. You're about to be trotted out at rallies. Tell us about the first time that happened and the schism that was opened up between yourself and the family.
Well, I think that was why the theme of family betrayal is so prominent in the book. And obviously later I come to the conclusion that the real family betrayal was the system of apartheid. But that's another conversation. But in terms of my father and my family, I think what was clear to me was that as the oldest son in the Verwoed family, he took on the role of protecting the honor, the loyalty. And that's been his life work, really. And that's still the case. And I carry his name. And I think when I started to ask these questions and started to question, he thought this was a student, like a young person, and that I will come to my senses. But when I actually said, I'm going to join the ANC, for him that was too much. And he basically said, you are now betraying your grandfather, you are shaming the family, and you are no longer welcoming in this family home. And that was the end of that relationship for about 10 years. But for him, it was so important to be loyal to his father that he couldn't accept my involvement with what he saw as the enemy of his community, of his family.
How did that make you feel?
Well, that at that point was the most difficult part of the whole journey. And it, in a sense, when I look back at it, it gave me a very visceral, existential understanding that reconciliation is not rainbowism. That it's not about some kind of easy walking into the sunset, but that it comes with justice. It comes with willingness to stand up to where things are wrong, even if it means alienation from people close to you. And that helped me. In that sense, he was also helping me to be real. And I think in the wider society, the fact that he was also public about his criticism helped people to perhaps have a little bit more trust in the integrity of my decision, that it wasn't a careerist, move to suddenly become involved with the ANC, but that it was part of a faith-based commitment
But
to
it's double-edged,
reconciliation.
right? Which is why the book is tinged with exceptional insight into the complexity of reconciliation as a political project in society, but also inside the family unit. Because on the one hand, your father making it very clear to the Afrikaner community in whose eye he doesn't want his own estimation to go down, that my son has faltered and he does not represent our thought as a family.
Yeah.
That, on the one hand, like you say, inadvertently signals the depth of your integrity, because no one can think that you are doing this thing as just some sort of cool youngster who is going through a phase. But on the other hand, and I know that you care about this because every time you go and visit Pa, when there's an opportunity to make amends and there is just a hug or a parting shot conversation between the two of you that happens a couple of times, then you think to yourself privately, okay, maybe the relationship can be repaired. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because later on, for example, when Stellenbosch invites you to come and say a couple of words, and I think it was a bust of Verwoerd that was to be removed, then what looked like a journey on the mend, your relationship with your dad, suddenly backslides again. So there's no linear process in trying to handle this stuff.
Exactly. I mean, I've just come to accept that there's a fragility in this relationship that I have to live with, that I cannot prioritize mending that relationship above my commitment to the wider society. But he remains my father, and I also want to love him as my father and actually emotionally allow myself to feel that, because even with my grandfather, I never really allowed myself post my big political change to even be emotionally connected to them. So I want to honor the fact that they are my ancestors. I mean, ironically, he is my father, so I have to respect that. At the same time, I cannot allow his views to determine my commitment to reconciliation. But, that's not a philosophical thing. It's a very, it's almost living with an irreconcilable tension. Like that's what reconciliation for me has come to mean, that it means unavoidable conflict with people that I love, that I respect, and that I try to understand. But at the same time, it means a commitment to becoming part of a bigger family. And I don't want to use that metaphor glibly, but that's the plural in the subtitle, the family betrayals, because when you look at the wider society and you see that what we've done to fellow brothers and sisters in our faith, in our humanity, and what the system of apartheid did to family life through all those legislations that impacted on families, then that's the fundamental betrayal. And that's what I need to stand up for, even if that means my father really finds that difficult to accept.
There are three big themes in the book. The first is reformation. We've spent a lot of time on your watershed moment and what occasioned it. Then there is an attempt to grapple with the rehumanization. And then towards the end, you obviously, which was my favorite part, talk about what real reconciliation is about. And I want to just touch on some of the essence of some of those themes. I think one of the best ways to really bring out the importance of rehumanization and what that means practically for you is tell us a little bit about this weird arrangement of where you live and the neighbors and there are no fences.
Yes.
And then very importantly, introduce into this conversation the public to Emily.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. Yes, so part of my commitment to try and live in a different way is to find a neighborhood that actually is trying to live together across race and class and cultural divisions. And just outside Stellenbosch, we have a Lyndag eco-village where about 35 families from quite different backgrounds are actually trying to live together, ecologically aware but also socially diverse. And the gift of being in that space is to be neighbors to the Mabeba family. And the grandmother of that family is Emily Mabeba. And we've become just close, just being neighbors, being involved in each other's lives as families, going to church together, just gardening together, but also having deep conversations. And while I was working on the diaries of my grandmother, I realized that I want also to listen to grandmothers from within the black community who can talk to me about what it really was like to live through the 50s and the 60s at an ordinary level, not as a high level political activist, but just a mother trying to actually get her children to get a good education, finding work, the pass law system in particular. And Emily was willing to sit down with me, and we sat down for hours, and she just talked and just told me stories about what it meant as a woman, as a person trying to find an education in a system where you had all the racial classification, and how you get your children through good education in the midst of the 70s and the 80s. And that to me was one of those things where you realize I worked in the TRC, I've been involved in the ANC, but I still don't really understand the depths of what the slow violence, the systemic violence of apartheid was about.
On page 222, you write, Emily once told me how hard she had to work to be accepted for training at Pretoria Technikon to become a dental assistant. Of the 20 places available, 19 were reserved for whites. This story reminded her of something that had happened while she was working at Baragwanath Hospital. This was the only anecdote she ever told me in which she segued into Afrikaans. I was earning 300 Rand a month, and this white guy was a porter. He hadn't even finished high school, and he was earning 900 Rand. He asked to see my check. I showed him, and he said, "Wow, my vel is my graad," translated as "my skin is my degree."
Yeah.
You write that story because there's an insight that landed for you. I don't want to judge your relatives because we don't know their stories. That I wonder whether everyone in your family internalized the insight. And the insight that you make is the distinction between, as you refer to it as, you came to realize, quote unquote, that my Verwoerd is different to Emily's Verwoerd.
Yeah, big time. Like there's a huge gulf. Like and it's irreconcilable in many ways. And I need to be willing to go and sit in that discomfort. And why I actually wrote the book, and I did write it first in Afrikaans, was because people like Emily and her daughter Naledi would say, we are tired, even in the village, of becoming angry to make the white members of this village aware of just how complex this notion of racism is, and how the small, the microaggressions, etc. And that we want you, what are you willing to do to raise awareness? Absolutely. And the same question came from students at Stellenbosch, black students saying, what are you willing to do? So the white work part of this journey really is behind what is behind this book. And for you as a black South African or person of color, and people who out there who come from those backgrounds, I am very grateful if you're willing even to listen to this conversation and you're even willing to read the book. But I hope mainly that this will reach English-speaking white South Africans and Afrikaans-speaking white South Africans, so that we can do more of that work of facing the reality of what the legacy of apartheid is.
99% of the comments on social media are generous, and people are listening closely and actively. That's a huge percentage that any writer will settle for when they start out with a book.
I'm very grateful for that, yeah.
I do like occasionally the productive value of the 1% that one can ignore as patterns. For what it's worth, this one stings both you and me. Lungile says, an excellent journalist doing the PR bidding of white supremacy. When you hear that kind of description, and given what you've gone through in your own family, being ostracized for trying to carve out something good out of your genetic history that you had not chosen, how would you respond to Lungile if he was sitting here?
Oh, thank you, Lungile, for saying that. My wife teaches maths in Kailicha and Mitchell's Plain, and she tries to get the young people to lean into the difficult questions instead of avoiding them.
Yeah.
And those kinds of comments for me is the kind of thing you have to lean into. To what is, I would love to sit down with Lungile and hear what is the story behind that, because I'm pretty sure that, as I find amongst younger black students at Stellenbosch, there's a deep-seated disillusionment and a deep-seated sense of frustration about the lack of progress post-1994 and the ongoing wealth represented by people like me. So in that setting, I'm not surprised that people would say, come on, what is really going on here in terms of this process?
What is this notion of embodied Ubuntu?
For me, I mean, Ubuntu, again, has been domesticated, like Archbishop Tutu's Rainbow Nation. Those metaphors have become very domesticated in white hands mostly. So I want to be careful of how I use it. But my colleague, for example, Professor Pumla Gebote Madikizela, has really helped me, and other black South Africans have helped me to understand the truth. And people like Emily and Naledi Mabeba, that I am who I am in relationship, especially with the other. But that can only work if I'm honest about what I bring into that relationship as a white South African, as a middle-aged, Afrikaans-speaking Verwoerd. That's my embodiment. And when I'm honest about that and willing to actually say, I'm bringing this into this relationship with humble, restitutional responsibility, then Ubuntu comes alive. And then it actually becomes liberating to take on these big issues of our past and our present, because in the process, it actually is deeply, deeply liberating as a human being. And I do find my humanity being gifted back to me by people who I am responsible for systemically for taking away, as it were, their humanity.
I want to end by having you speak to white South Africans. And this was, for me, a really, really, one of the parts of the book I really enjoyed was your discussion around the refrain we often hear from white South Africans. What is enough? What must I do? And there's a conversation between you and your colleague Alistair that you unravel round about page 220 or thereabouts. I'm not going to give the full context, and we can have you back on the show in future for aspects that we couldn't tease out today. But you write this. And even without the context, the paragraph will make sense to you as you are listening. On the one hand, I was challenged by Alistair to be more honest with myself, to investigate more thoroughly the motives behind my question, what would be enough? How much self-interest lurked behind my concern about too much shared responsibility? Was I trying to mark out a sustainable share, or was I actually trying to get rid of a heavy burden? To the extent that the latter desire was playing a role, my enough question became a symptom of my underlying tendency to accept too little responsibility. I mean, I just think that is so stunning. And I think there's an insight there that travels from the context of your book into many other, both interpersonal and political contexts. Yeah. But I'm going to give you a full minute to, not that it needs translation, because I think it's clear, to speak directly to white South Africans and just say what you meant in that paragraph.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it is this kind of baffling reality that where, if you look at it historically, if you look at it factually, there are so many blatant ways in which we've been systematically privileged in terms of education, health, access to wealth, land, everything. But somehow we tend to individualize, when we talk about, responsibility. And we start to talk about my story and how I'm not like them, or I have done enough, or I'm not, whatever ways I'm struggling. So to find a way to take on our collective identity as white South Africans in the midst of all our differences, but to actually say systemically we need to face this, and we need to do it for the sake also of coming truly home in this country, and for the sake of becoming human. Because we cannot just be individuals. We are members of these larger groups, systemically, historically, also of the so-called, white group, racialized as white South Africans. And we need to be willing to lean into that whiteness and not to just point the finger at all the problems in the current government, or just to become individual in our stories of how we struggle to find work or how our children are leaving the country, which they do. Absolutely. But not to use that as an excuse not to face our responsibility.
Wilhelm, geluk met die boek. And it's an ongoing journey. I applaud you for grappling with facts about your genealogy that you could not have chosen, but you have taken up the historical burden of grappling with what that means for you in the year and now.
Thank you, Eusebius, and thank you for people who listened.
Bongani Bingwa, 702 Breakfast. Weekday mornings, 6 to 9.
Has business lost its influence over this government?
I don't think it's a question of influence. President Ramaphosa, as the president of this country, is probably going to have to make some decisions that are not